Grazie di essere qui a
Thank you very
GiovedìScienza.
much for having come here to GiovedìScienza for this meeting, which should be used to understand how many lies surround us and to understand them, and if possible, to recreate things as they are. This has always been difficult. Currently, it is even more so because we've all become, to a degree, sources of information. In the past, there were some very centralized sources, newspapers, which referred to even more centralized sources, that is to say, the press agencies. They had their journalists, but agencies have always been necessary since the onset, that is to say, since the existence of the press as we know it, 1840-45. In the end, it was not so difficult to get back and understand what the source was. But now, whether we like it or not, we're a source, because when we do something on Facebook or somewhere else, we become a source of information on ourselves that someone is accumulating and using, which in most cases means sell them. It is what we were talking about this morning with about 1,000 students. When we think about using the internet and having something free, in fact, this means that we are the commodity. They are buying us, our data, where we are, our tastes, our preferences, and then resell it. And we don't realize that that's what we're paying for. We're in a very complex world from this point of view. Furthermore, within the network, and not only, you can see it also in the newspapers, there is a very strong polarization. Newspapers are increasingly parties, and each Facebook account is a party that then clusters with the likewise ones, which means that you then strengthen the opinions within the group, but there is no dialogue. This is why the real growth and understanding of the world, which happens in a dialectic manner, is as if it were crystallized, frozen in time. When Dr. Bagnasco, a member of our committee, and Pino Zappalà also, and others got the idea of this conference, which is a long time ago, because GiovedìScienza is usually planned about a year in advance from the conference. It was then a very important topic, but now it's even more so, because what we're seeing with the new US president and what we're seeing with many party leaders and what we see with populist parties, if we want to label them roughly, if we want to say, have an approximate idea, if we look at what this situation is, we see the triumph of this problem, of this picture, which had been identified about a year ago, but which is now very clear. Now, we had thought that we would ask Walter Quattrociocchi, whom I thank for being here this evening. We thought we would ask him to help us read into this situation. Asking him has a meaning because he is the coordinator of the sociology lab, computational sociology, not IT, and they study this type of phenomenon. He studies it with the scientific method, which is the one which we believe has to be the constitution of rationality, the constitutional charter of rationality. There will be no ideological position, but there will be the analysis of a phenomenon. Walter Quattrociocchi has written a book with another author, which is called Disinformation, published by Franco Angeli, and you will find it at the entrance. This in itself is the result of a lot of work that was carried out by this institute, which, if I am not mistaken, is in Lucca. There have been many discussions in favor and against Quattrociocchi. We are, well, once I'd read an essay by a US sociologist, I can't remember his name, that says we are a society based on trust. For example, if there's a baker who gets up at 2 in the morning and bakes bread, it's because he or she believes that someone's going to buy it. And then there's someone who leaves the house and goes out to buy bread, and they do so because they trust that someone has baked bread. So the entire world works on trust, but there are cases where trust is not well founded. Thank you very much. The floor to you.
Parliamo della post-truth, cioè questa post-verità.
The title is Post-Truth Society. This is what are the slides that I'm using in various parts of the world just now. We're talking about post-truth, that is to say, what we currently talk about a lot today, and which summarizes our day and age. We talk a lot about fake news. They have become a monster, the boogeyman, so much so that the Oxford Dictionary has decided that for 2016 the word of the year is post-truth. And the definition is relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion that appeals to emotion and personal belief. This means that we use our emotions to interpret. This is also part of science and how it has been narrated, because very often we want to tell a story rather than remain linked to the objective facts. For example, Eli Pariser wrote this book called The Filter Bubble, saying that in practice, thanks to algorithms, we have created a world which reflects exclusively on what we wish to see. But Pariser, too, in this is non-scientific, as we will see preceding it. Is not the fault of the algorithms, because algorithms, this artificial intelligence, which we're so fearful of, just mimes our behavior. What emerges is, and I think in particular this is true for Facebook and Twitter, and we nearly have 2 billion people who are connected to Facebook. This world, which to a degree becomes a magic island which is isolated, mirrors the way in which we act. Facebook algorithms simulate our way of reacting with people. To now leave Pariser and hermeneutics behind us, that is to say, writing about about theory based on intuition, we're going to try and create a framework which will enable us to carry out experiments and measure these phenomena, such as polarization, wish to be confirmed, and which make it possible for us to use mechanical statistics, basically thermodynamics, to study these processes. The idea of this approach of complex systems which consider a society or the community not as a series of people, but as a number of individuals who interact, and the sum of interactions is the one which determines the process, a bit like an anthill. In an anthill, everybody has their own role, but there is no hierarchical awareness. There is no myth of the queen that governs, but there are interaction mechanisms that lead to what is called the emerging of the process. The idea is that of applying this experimental framework, which we luckily have good maths for, applying therefore physics, which means collecting the results of observations control and mathematical modeling, starting with sociology, social psychology questions, and using statistics and physics to build and to carry out measurements. For a long time, we've been talking about post-truth. Aeschylus also spoke about the fact that we gather information to identify with the group. Jules Verne, too, spoke about submarines. Now, one thing is thinking about a submarine, one other thing is building one, and the other one is measuring the impact. This is called computational social science. That's the technical definition. It started in the Northeastern University. Lazare was the one who developed it in 2009, and he said, we have so many data, it's endless. Every day we produce on Google, on our mobiles, on Facebook, on WhatsApp. Why don't we use such data to gain a better understanding of our behavior? Applying these techniques, and a lot of progress has been made. Here in the top left, you see a very beautiful figure. We're able to see society under a magnifying glass. Here you see this is the distribution of the languages spoken in New Jersey, looking at tweets. That is to say, we're able to see what the ethnographic distribution of a state is by looking at the languages used on Twitter. But that is not a science. It's simply descriptive statistics. It's a snapshot of a process, and in that process, we're not yet able to raise hypotheses which we will validate. So this has meant that, yes, we will try a new approach, a new humanism, a new approach to social sciences. We leave hermeneutics, intuition, and stimulation aside, and let us try to think on the basis of the data that we have, trying to understand which questions we have. This in itself required an enormous effort, especially to communicate with very separate worlds. For example, physicists speaking to sociologists, very rare. Very often they can't speak to each other. They speak very different languages, different starting points. After the initial effort, we have defined a new device where the link between all these was the application of the scientific method as such. The effort, therefore, is in terms of the questions that are raised through those data. Now, we started with a situation where physics had already studied dynamics of opinions, where they go, social dynamics, and so on. But they used a metaphor that was too simple. It was oversimplified. A virus. Virus is fine if we talk about marketing, information gathering, but the effect of information on opinion is not fitting, because I don't wish to develop a virus, while information requires trust, requires a bond between the two. If you lack this, you will not include a series of attitudes. We talk about intentionality, trust, and what we will see, which is essential, and that our experiments show, that is to say, the killer in this case is called a confirmation bias. In other words, our tendency to gather information, not because it's true, but simply because they're suited to see what we believe, or for us to see it. The context we're in, I'm sure we've all noticed that compared to 20 years ago, information has changed drastically. In fact, we go from an environment which was completely mediated, that is to say, journalist, the expert who selects the topics that are going to be conveyed through the media, television at the time and newspaper, to the public. And then as the social media develop, we then get to a situation which is completely destructured with no intermediation. That is to say, the expert puts on his or her blog something. This is then retransmitted through the social network, and that information is no longer one person, but will be selected by a group of users, and those group of users will use it as if they were posting a picture of a cat, a selfie or something, which means you've put that information in the supermarket of the information, or the supermarket of information is what we have and where we see what we're doing. Mark Zuckerberg, the Facebook man, says we don't wish to create more information. We want to create a new structure to enable information to circulate more rapidly. This might seem harmless, but this destroys, in fact, all the tools that previously mediated and filtered the information. The intermediate structure has come apart. The problem refers to the quality of information. This one on the left is our first study on these things. Boston 2014, Trump was still to come, but already the notion of fake information, use of fake information was linked to Trump. Currently, Trump is the President of the United States. So the phenomenon that we identified has become even more important. On the internet, we very often find false information. As Albert Einstein says, the problem with quotes found in the internet is that they're often false, and you've got Bruno Lauzi's face there. Other very interesting things happened. This is an example of fake information or disinformation. July 2015. There was a meeting of the FBI in Quantico, open one. It was a press conference, and they say that the army is going to carry out a military exercise against terrorism in the United States. There are all the tweets, and within a few hours, the message becomes Obama is about to carry out a coup in the US. It didn't only involve the stupid people, ignorant people. The governor of Texas, as a result of this, got the National Guard on alert, asking them to monitor the border. Texas is a very particular state, but to a degree, there is an inversion of the process of selection. Everything is plausible and in the doubt. Since we lack the trust we were talking about before, I am going to credit and move as a result. In Italy, we're not so much better off. We're brothers of the United States in that respect. This is something that Pertini was said to have said but hadn't, and the Pertini Foundation says that it's not true, because when the government does not do what the people want, it must be fired with stones and sledgehammers. He never said this, but what is this type of information, fake information? It is the imitation of people. So if you put a message which is plausible but untrue, a Dada-like message, and see what happens. And this is the effect. Here you see the demonstrations, but in fact, people were saying that they would fight the government with stones and sledgehammers. You wrote that on the leaflet. I don't know if someone says it. Some people say if President Pertini said it, but we like it. Here's a confirmation bias. This is the confirmation bias. We don't like it. Sorry, we don't know whether it's true or not, but we like it. This is a post-truth society. This is another work of art of the Italian data troll, Piero Ballerini, who's a hat maker in Florence, very intelligent, decided to make a joke and wrote this post where it says that Italian Senate voted and accepted a law proposed by Senator Cirenga aimed at funding with 134 billion euros the policymakers to find a job in case of defeat in their political competition. That's 10% of the Italian GDP. There is no Senator Cirenga. The Senator Cirenga that, given the end of the parliamentary term, suggested a bill funded with 134 billion euros for policymakers to find a job in case of defeat in the political competition. It's roughly the equivalent of 6 budgets. There is no Senator Cirenga. There's a Facebook page. There's a person called Senatore by name and Cirenga by surname. In the text that accompanies the information, the image, it's stated very clearly. If you believe this fake news, you're gullible and you should get the government that you've got. Really, there is no reason why you shouldn't. 100 and a million, he ended up on the global risk of the World Forum. It was like a Christian Zara joke. And in fact, we should say, you see, you're talking about making funds. You've got a fund for the severance pay of the members of parliament. Shame on you, shame on you. In fact, it wasn't true, but 1 million.5 shares. A confirmation bias is a human characteristic. We all share it, and it's that tendency to select information because we like it, not because it's true, because very often we're not able to know what is true and what is false. But it's always been like that. We've always been like that. We're all come from the same monkey. It's not only the gullible people or others, those who or the uneducated. We all have this bias. This is a very pretty example, if you'll allow me. This is an interview which they've asked me on Wired, talking about the circulation of information. The interview was to Walter Quattrociocchi, and Walter Quattrociocchi says, provocating, it's best to have people who, like you, gather information. 3 seconds later, we get the comment, there you are. Did you read the article? The article was an interview to me. And Walter Quattrociocchi, my name, is rather unusual. So he hadn't read the article, but accuses me of not having read the article, which was in fact my interview. The World Economic Forum, which is associated with the Freemasonry, the Masons of the Freemasons of the world, writes this report every year with a list of global risks. It's called the Global Risk Report. In 2013, it said that digital misinformation was one of the main risks for our society. It was as bad as terrorism. Why? It's very easy here to take a position by confirmation bias. I think that most of you think that the university system has dropped standards, Berlusconi has ruined us, we've lost all our civic sense. No, that's not the reason, unfortunately. There are other factors that will have influence, but the big problem is that the complexity of the world that faces us has exploded. The trends that we have to talk about very often are very complex and not easily communicate. There is an upstream problem in identifying what is true and what is fake. When we talk about the financial crisis, for example, there may be problems, but the spreading of the financial crisis is extremely complex, and not everybody is able to understand it. We sublimate uncertainty, which to a degree we feel, and we have an irrational analysis and analyze it emotionally. We're faced with a world which is hyperconnected, which explodes in terms of technology, so much so that the technological process is going on without any control, and we still haven't learned to coexist with this system. And furthermore, we also have an explosion in the amount of information. In fact, we have between 120 and 420 news items or information items. So the concentration time is about 8 seconds per person, while for example, general article was 2 to 3 minutes. In those 8 seconds, we take the words that we like, we reorganize them, reinterpret them according to what we know, and go on. What happens? Well, we thought that we would recreate an experiment. Very nice experiment. We took all the sources of information on Facebook that dealt with scientific information, and also that gave us alternative plot-like political information on 2 different nations, Italy and the US, and we went to see how users that are exposed to the plot-like information react to 2 types of information and stimuli. The first is how they react to trolls or respond to trolls, intentionally false claims that make fun of their narrative but are consistent with them. For example, we don't know what the chemical wakes have, but they listed what the airplanes released in the stream, and they spoke about Viagra or other chemicals, and we went to see whether this information, which was clearly fake, was absorbed by these people. Vice versa, there's debunking, that is to say, how these people react to posts that contrast their information. Rather than saying, what are these chemicals, let me see, how do you react when you say, no, there is no such thing of a chemical stream with aeroplanes. So it goes against what you believe. Here are a few facts and figures. The Italian sample is about 2 million people, 1.8, 55 million for the US, the population of Italy. We carried out another experiment on 370 million people. We're talking about big data here. Here you see these graphs are possibly very difficult to understand, but if I explain them, they're very, very simple. The first top left simply says that those who follow scientific information only follows those. Those who follow alternative information only follows that, and there's no one who goes from one to the other. There are groups of people who specialize on the type of narration they don't go over. Pariser, remember, was saying it's to do with the algorithms. No, we carried out an experiment and we counted the people how many people liked science and how many people liked conspiracy, how many friends you have that share your same ideas. If you, for example, vie for one soccer team or the other. 8 clicks and we're surrounded on, say, people who are pro-Juventus or pro-Toro. Those are the 2 local teams. In 65% of my friends would be conspiracy people, if I am too. Facebook gives you information on the pages which I follow. If my friends roughly follow the same pages as me, we will end up in that state where I will only hear one side of the matter. This is not only Italian, it's also true in the US, exactly the same, very strong polarization. First result, how do users react? How do they respond? You know, how do you react when people say that chemical streams or wakes contain Viagra? There, 80% interacts with this type of information and also brings them back to the group of reference. This was called an echo chamber. It is a group which echoes, a closed environment where you echo your opinions and you only see what you want to see, thus strengthening your position. Somebody from CCAP got really angry. I see things differently. But in fact, out of 55 million users in the US, 10 million potentially have debunking. That is to say that they need this because they receive fake news. But only 5,000 interact with the information linked to plot, and they're the most conspiracy, and they're the most active ones. If this is a very complex thing now, what I'm going to say, if we take these 5,000 users, this very small group, and we see how they interact with their sources before and after debunking posts, before and after, we see that there is a shift. That is to say, they increase the number of conspiracy-related hits. This is called the big fire effect. In psychiatry, the process is described like this. If there is a paranoid, say, patient who believes that he is going to be poisoned, when he says, I am going to poison you, most people would say, we're all here, nobody wishes to poison you. But at that point, the psychiatrist will say that paranoid becomes more structured. When I go to that person and I say there is no global structure, no global order, they will believe that I belong to the new global order. This experimental setting, which is very simple, has made it possible for us to map with a mathematical model. And this made it possible again, in turn, to know where they might more easily circulate. Here you see the rumor spreading modeling. Here you see there are very polarized clusters. You can see the topic that the person is following, and this will help us identify the type of post which this person is probably going to interact with a 97% degree of certainty. So we have transferred or transformed experimental data into model. This is the application of the scientific model to sociological processes. And then there's a last ingredient which pushes things together. Let's going back, we have all this information. It's like the information supermarket. We go inside, we select the information, we choose the information which is more consistent with the way we see things. And again, this is to do with the soccer teams. If I like or hate Juventus or Toro, I will support one or the other. But I will only really meet up with people who are fans of the same club. With these people, I will exchange ideas on what really we share. Sustain that between 2008 and 2013 was one of the greatest minds of our century, but worked for the White House in 2018, 2013, and he spoke about group polarization. That is to say, two people who think the same things, when they talk about the subject, they will become more and more extreme. This was the problem that he had discussed with reference to juries. When a jury has to give a verdict, you saw that people are more polarized than if they had been taken separately. This is also true on social networks. Two people who believe in conspiracy, if they believe the same thing, they will strengthen their mutual opinions. In fact, this plot shows you very clearly that as the echo chamber's activity increases, it influences people more and more. It's even worse when the two groups clashes, when, say, the Juventus fans and the Toro fans clash. Then it becomes even more polarized. 2 words on the impact of research. It says that the efforts that we're making to debunk are not as effective as we would like them to be. Debunking remains in the domain of those who already believe in debunking. Social networks, in fact, are not the sort of channel of information that will help people change their minds. It will just reinforce existing beliefs. So much so that the Washington Post had a column on debunking, which is called "What Was Fake on the Internet This Week?" And in July, they closed this, and they said that they closed it because they realized that misinformation and fake news is so strong and polarization is so strong that the effort that we do here, sitting down and writing this, is not worth it. We have to change methods, we have to change approach, we have to go back, we have to invent other ways to circulate correct information and reclaim this environment which is full of fake news. One of the first accusations that we received is that you'd taken the extreme scientific and also the plot or conspiracy theories. So at this point, we decided to generalize the problem. This article has been accepted by PLOS, and we went to see how 376 million Facebook users related with or how they interacted with papers, with newspapers or news. So there was a monitoring of articles on a global way. We took the list of the European Media Monitor. We mapped them one by one on Facebook. For 1 year, we had to upload data, download data, and slowly we recreated and analyzed, but we haven't got clusters and others, so there are 4 of us, and we worked on a very simple basis. We had to work a lot to do this, and we found a confirmation of this model. The more active a user is, the more specialized he or she is. The more activity, the more focused they are. If, for example, I read newspaper X, I will only follow X. If I follow Y, I will follow Y. While first, it was an imposition, that is to say, we spoke about narration here, we saw that, in fact, users tend to focus on a limited set of information sources. and they specialize on it. This creates a structure which is extremely polarized. And it is clusters and users polarization. This echo chamber becomes a bubble. And we don't wish to find a situation where your opinions are contradicted. This is a generic result, but applied to Brexit, for example. Very recent. Again, we took all the sources of information in the UK. We took the subset of the post of information that spoke about that type of information, and here you have an enormous polarization, which tells us that the Leave group was followed much more than Remain, in spite of the fact that Remain had been positively upheld by the social network. This is a rather unusual passage. Look at it. In fact, through a series of algorithms, we extracted the notions or concepts that the various newspapers suggested, and we analyzed the response by users. When you talk well about Remain, people, you have a very negative approach. So there is an inconsistency between what the journalists said and what the users decided. Using this technique, which is quite sophisticated, we are able to do something which might frighten, but is very interesting from a scientific point of view. Take an echo chamber and a group of reference, so we are able to retrace the postulates of this underlying this narration and the truth value that is attributed to it. This is extremely useful as far as journalism and communication are concerned, because it gives a strong indication of what are the subjects that should not be touched or should be touched when you talk about something like that. This is a first step, considering the second one, which refers to the psychometric activity. When you are on social networks, a number of traits of our personality are monitored. In fact, it is very likely that this type of information can be used for psychological profiling. Putting together the profile of individuals and the beliefs that underlie, for example, say vegans. How many vegans are present here? Raise your hands. They're shy vegans. In any case, I will never talk about vegans, but I'm saying that the narration, the vegan narration, sees not only something about food and nutrition, but also about ethics. So you must avoid, you mustn't eat what you have to kill. So there are a series of beliefs. For example, they're well predisposed towards nature. The bad list includes also the global network or the global order. And some people, for example, would say that butchers should be killed. That's a bit extreme. But in any case, we can recreate the postulates. We can recreate the dominant personalities in the group. And at that point, we have a very useful tool which makes it possible to create a narration so or in such a way that it can act on those postulates. This is a very interesting story. Last year, when we wrote the first article, it was a great success all over the world. Michela Del Vicario, who was a PhD student and now is a postdoc, very good, received an email, and he said, "Look, Walter, Cass Sunstein wrote to me," and I nearly fainted. He said, "What do you mean? Please forward the email." And Cass Sunstein, who'd been saying these things, so he was the Jules Verne of the submarine, He said, "Greetings, just discovered your paper on polarization, misinformation, debunking. They're amazing and fabulous, path-breaking, I think, all best wishes. Why don't we write something together?" So we summarized all the results on this. And in Lucca, in the province of Lucca, we live really outside the world. The people who worked with Obama came to seek us out because they saw that we had been able to prove something that they believed. And our suggestion was that the Global Risk Report 2016, which is what we'd use the 2013 one, started working with us, and we now contribute to the drafting of the Global Risk Reports, and we will do so for the 2016 one. But 10 days ago, we spoke about the distortion effect of social networks on the formation of public opinion. Now this, what's the way out? This is the question. How can we manage? How can we cope? It's a sort of Pandora's box. This was the. There's a conflict of interest here because she's Sanstein's wife, but she was the former U.S. ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, and it was the Howard graduation ceremony, and she said that we're living in a world where we tend to strengthen our opinion, but the problem is not fake information per se, because there is no narration that gives truth. There is no approach to truth that is totally objective. Science has one only strong point, is that it is skeptical of itself too, to the point that it's very democratic. Some people have said that science is not democratic. On vaccines, for example, vaccines, is science democratic? Science delegates its level of democracy to a third party, i.e. the scientific model. If I have an idea, whether it's Einstein or my grandmother, it's the same weight because it's the scientific method that has to validate it or not. It is true that the scientific world has also inherited jealousies, power groups, and so on. But on the whole, we can say that the knowledge system is the humblest that we have, but unfortunately we were unable to explain that science is not religion. Science is not a religion. Very often people want certainties. Science is not able to say what is true and what is false. Science will talk about whether something can be falsified, that is to say, it is true unless otherwise proven. This doesn't mean that there is total relativism. There are some things that are true and some things that are false. So I am not a nihilist. But there's all that debate that we've read, that is to say, fact-checking. Yesterday, on an Italian daily, La Stampa said that Indonesia, the Islamic State, has issued a fatwa against fake information. A fatwa. Fact-checking, that's very much like that, isn't it? We're saying that there are some priests, high priests of the system, that have to tell us whether it's true or false. And that the truth is something that science very often cannot validate. Very often we talk about probabilities in science. So the problem of misinformation is that the misinformation is just the tip of the iceberg. We've always had misinformation. There have always been approximations. It lacks accuracy. But the problem is that currently complexity comes to be, and it circulates without any interface. We're all exposed to it, and we find it very difficult to manage to govern this complexity. On Tuesday, the head of the Italian Parliament, the speaker, said that she would, in fact, act on this precisely because she recognizes the political and social importance of it. Without a reliable type of information. We're not in a democracy that we can be influenced. Putin, for instance, has a program, and NATO is studying it, a program who uses trolls to favor the misinformation and polarization with all the countries, the neighboring countries. Jessica Hallow has done this because she joined this group of trolls, and she sees a world that is unintelligible. There are people who are there and shift social opinion through trolls, creating polarization. Democracy is very much aware of this. I'm pleased, and in fact I subscribe to what the Speaker of the Italian Parliament said, because we must become aware of the fact not so much that misinformation and fake news is important, but we must become aware of the fact that to a degree we are in a post-teenage phase where we realize that the world is not black and white, but it's full of complex things, very complex things, but still we're not able to cope with it. And in this respect, probably this is possibly also the responsibility of academia. I don't really think that it's my fault personally, because I'm still in the lower rungs, because we have a scientific academic elite that publishes in journals that very often are their own parish, so to speak. They are usually managed by friends and relatives. The hermeneutical approach has become, that is to say, writing novels is equivalent to scientific knowledge. The process of persuasion of how good we are, how charismatic the professor is, means that whatever the professor says is right, while the people who start with the opposition are wrong. This type of dialectics between the people and the elite is broken now. Trump has embodied this. Trump didn't win because of fake information. Fake information was used both by Trump and by Clinton. Trump won, and Chernovich, the person who managed the media campaign, he won because he identified an alternative narrative to the dominant one, and people followed it because there was a very strong lack of trust in institutions. I don't trust institutions. If science says vaccines are good, the reason why I refuse them is because I don't trust the person. And here this becomes crucial. The confirmation bias is more powerful, is stronger than the reputation of the expert. 2016, the World Health Organization gives two messages, one after the other. In the first, in vaccines, it says we're below the critical threshold, and for the community, this is proof of the fact that WHO is interfering and following the interests of Big Pharma. They want to promote the Big Pharma. A few months ago, they say that meat causes colon cancer. They don't say this, but they say that a certain amount of red meat increases the probability of getting colon cancer. It's interpreted as meat causes colon cancer. And that belief is taken and is included as truth. And the World Health Organization in that case in the first case was negative. The vaccines becomes a Bible. And so people are not interested in the source, but the message, as long as it corresponds to your narrative. That's what Obama says. We're more worried with the information that fits our narration rather than what can be tested empirically. So we have an enormous problem of communication from this point of view. And the initiative that we've tried to do is called, with reference to what Samantha Power was saying, is that I mustn't speak to people because I'm right, but because they too might be right. That is to say, reopen channels of communication. science as a service, not for myself. This should be the idea. And we're creating a permanent observatory in Geneva where we meet the several experts that meet institutions, journalists, scholars, and we discuss misinformation. First and foremost, the circulation of information or dissemination of the awareness of a problem, opening arenas of discussion. The World Economic Forum that works in the same way, saying, this is the problem. How do we work it? How do we solve it? The initiative so far has included a number of people, also Schlesinger, and I hope that with Boldrini, that is to say the speaker, the observatory, and the participation of all the actors, there will be a greater awareness of the problem, trying to understand how God may be dead, but we still don't know how we can live without him. Science is not a religion, and that is what I had to say. Thank you.
Credo ci sia già anche, tra poco accenderanno la luce.
Very much. Thank you
Qualche
very much,
microfono
Walter
pronto per voi.
Quattrociocchi. We still have 10-15 minutes for questions. I think there will be questions.
In attesa che ci sia la prima domanda, provo a farne
While
una
waiting
io.
for the first question, I'm going to ask one.
Banale e in parte anche un po' autobiografico. Nacque il CICAP molto
Which is a bit autobiographical.
limitato che doveva accertare l'eventuale
There was
validità
a committee many years ago, GCAP, that had to test the validity on paranormal. Now, currently is what role should a committee have? Should we say we were talking about paranormal or anything like that? Because it's very dated. In fact, nowadays we have very different approaches or problems, as we saw this evening. What could be their role today? I know that GCAP does debunking, but they do it possibly by analyzing sources and debunking falsitudes or fake news. Now, this method, which you illustrated, which refers to physics and which applies scientific methods to thinking, is it too technical to be used? Is it really a useful tool? Why the GCAP can have many people who join in, people who maybe are not able to understand algorithms such as yours?
L'approccio è fortemente elitario, sicuramente, perché richiede comunque sia delle competenze che non sono.
Yes, the approach is an elite one because it requires a degree of expertise that is not easily found. But we carried out experiments in Lucca. We created this project that we called Bufala and Porchetta, which means buffalo meat or mozzarella or a story, and porchetta, which means a pork pie, but also was a reference to people's libido. And we started talking not so much about the technical implications, but the result in itself. That is to say, we're extremely polarized, we followed narrations, we don't listen to other opinions, and we communicate from an emotional point of view. This sort of group started to talk about the problem, and at a certain point, the people go back to talking amongst themselves without the polarization. So you go back to a type of communication which is more human. That is to say, the professor who speaks and gives a lesson saying, you are stupid because you're not vaccinating, is not a very effective tool. People don't wish to vaccinate, also because we forget that the expert is not self-referential. It's something which is attributed by others. So have we ever, for example, be in the position of mother? I went to a conference at obstetrics talking about these things in Milan, and there I saw a hope. Because to communicate, to create communication, in fact, based on the people who receive the message. For example, a mother goes to a pediatrician, a bit anxiety, saying, I'm a bit worried if I vaccinate my child, could it be autistic? But it was published on the Lancet. It was, it was published, but why did they withdraw it? You don't know. You don't know all the processes that underlie it. And maybe there was a child who saw someone who had autism, and the mother does not only consider that as 0.00001%, it's 100%. So how can I communicate to the mother that the probability of having side effects or the child dying due to side effects is much lower than that of the child dying because of measles. So you have to reformulate the message, having new means of communication.
Buonasera. Siccome sto leggendo un libro intitolato
Since I'm reading a book called Virtual Unreality by Safer, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, to understand more about these topics, I wanted to know what you think of Wikipedia, since the author is not enthusiastic about it in terms of popularization and information. This is something extremely complex, which requires a conference in itself. Wikipedia, compared to Facebook, is different. Facebook causes polarization like Twitter, that is to say the division is on two sides, pro or against Trump or whatever. There's always a dichotomy, while Wikipedia instead has in itself, incorporates in the protocol to process information the finest idea of consensus, that is to say positions have to converge. And we see that Wikipedia is well presented. You see, it's presented as an encyclopedia which is a bottom-up. But behind Wikipedia, there's a war of religion, because complexity doesn't make it possible to say this is right, this is wrong, beyond any reasonable doubt. There's a clash, and very often the dominant position prevails. So it inherits the behavior of the social behavior of the community or society. Then there's another example. When Magnus D'Alembro died, somebody made a joke, put on Wikipedia, that Magnus D'Alembro had written Frère Jacques. Well, he certainly had nothing to do with it. And the newspapers, opened up Wikipedia and included, they said that he wrote Frère Jacques. So Wikipedia is relatively precise, but very prone to mistakes and fakes, and is the result of a social process. And as such, it carries and bears the imperfections. This is what I would like to say. I'm sorry, I can't hear. The answer is no. There is nothing reliable as such.
Diciamo che in questo mondo si sta diffondendo la...
In this world, we have the idea of lack of intermediation in all fields. So I think that all the things that are done from the top will no longer be accepted. So the idea is that we should start with a bottom-up process, maybe infiltrate worms in the various social networks, so that people should start thinking with their heads rather than with their stomachs. So you should train people. That is to say, rediscover an intelligence which will make it possible for you to think about things. Start from schools. True. Yes, this is one of the central points of the appeal that we're writing up. Everything is from schools. Schools must come back to being a place where you learn not just know what is true and what is false, but for the critical sense, which is the one that may lead you to say, I don't know, I'm not going to take a decision, I'm not going to make a decision now. Schools must be the central focus. Yes, training and schools, education must become central.
Posso?
Prego.
Volevo chiederle, ma non è che
I would like to ask you,
anche facendo
is it not that we're also
demonizzando la rete?
overreacting,
Senso,
demonizing the net?
in passato
In this sense, authoritative scholars in the past had spoken about the power and dangers of the media of the time, for example, television. Umberto Eco, Panzer in Italy had written about the phenomenology of quiz shows, for example. There always has been this manipulation of consensus, so much so that in Italy we had a gentleman who for 20 years conditioned the political life of our country thanks to televisions. So this type of information, which is also democratic, is it not to be managed rather than eliminated? I'll give you an example. The four of us live in Vinovo, outside Turin. Through WhatsApp, we have a neighborhood control. We've also created a group to keep the city clean and to inform the municipality if there's anyone dirtying the streets. The network, I think, in the end, is a tool, an instrument, and like all instruments, it's neither good nor bad. It depends on the use. Certainly, the world is more complex, and we have to be educated to the use of the network. Yes, in the sense that it's not new, and the dynamics is not new, but the scale, the order of magnitude is completely without comparison. So to try and identify the mechanism and putting it in an old paradigm doesn't work. Facebook, Twitter create a system which is entirely new. The human being will then use it to the best or worst, but in 2016, a little girl died of whooping cough because she wasn't vaccinated. For me, is unacceptable. 2016, whooping cough, unacceptable.
Buonasera. Allora, lei ha citato la porchetta.
You mentioned
Noi qui in Piemonte, io sono del Cile. Inventato, cioè importato.
I belong to CICAP, but we invented, you talked about the pork and the buffalo meat. We called it alcoholic rationality. We imported it here in Piedmont, because we realized that the classical conference, where there is someone who conveys their scientific result, means that the same people listening, it's much more interesting for the audience. But there are only 30 of us each time. It would be impossible to manage more if we really want to discuss how can we fight the 100,000s I like with a rational approach. You have to work in the small scale. You must develop the idea of communicating. You should have a fair where people carry out debates or have scientific debates. In Tuscany, we had a fair, and we created cookies, like fortune cookies that they have in the Chinese restaurants, and inside we put some of the fake news. So you would fish out a cookie, say, oh, I know this, yes, a friend of mine saw this. The idea is that we should sow doubt. We need a lot of goodwill, a lot of work. But this is what you have to do. You have to carve people. Science has become, in turn, an echo chamber. There are scientific processes that go on and do not emerge from the scientific debate. I, as a scientist, I do something not because I want people to tell me I'm good, but for some other reason. this educating to communication, and to go back to also a bit of fun, because with social networks, you live in a world which is outside the world you're living in. So we reinforce this by looking for the people who are like us. We must break this symmetry with games, laughing. Very often it's just having fun together.
In primis ho perso il conto, ma credo che i complimenti siano dovuti perché la conferenza era molto interessante.
You should be congratulated because the conference was really very interesting. In particular, since I work as a scientific popularizer, I agree entirely with what you said. Now the question. A topic, because I read about it in the media in the past month. What do you think of the anti-fake news filter that has been mentioned in Facebook? That too is fake news, in the sense that started in 2015, so they've been doing it for about 2 years on Facebook. What is it? It's paradoxical. People say if something is fake, then somebody processes the information, decides whether it's fake or not. So what do I do, for example, with the saint, Father Pius? The censorship is worse than the problem. Talking to a friend of mine, a Jesuit, he said, well, this is what happened during the heresies. We reacted with the Holy Office, the Inquisition. Well, since 2015, they've had it on Facebook. It doesn't work. Now they're talking about creating experts who will decide whether the information is true or false. Well, tell me, I say, this sentence is fake. And I would indicate it, and I would like to see what answer they give. It's paradoxical. Gödel says that we live in a world where logic is no longer able to describe itself. So the human being upstream, the high priest, like the fatwa, the approach, the healthy approach, is to say, the scientific one is to say the paradigm has changed. What can we do? First of all, come to terms with anxiety. We have control anxiety. When I talk about vaccines, which has to be communicated in a more human way, because the mother who thinks that they might lose an emotional contact with their child is not a minor problem, it's a big problem. When you talk about these things, they said, no, they must know the truth. Wait a minute. Hold your horses. And I've heard others, psychologists, saying, well-known psychologists, saying that a person who says that attributes autism to vaccines is because they are afraid of their genetic heritage. Well, wait a minute. The problem is beautiful, fascinating, and there's all the human idea behind it.
Non sono neanche sicuro di essere in tema.
I'm not even sure that I'm going to be talking about something which is relevant, but as far as how news is formed and also used a few years ago, and here I don't understand where the boundary is between science and non-science. A few years ago I was saying, on the basis and on the hypothesis of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, they caused a disastrous war. At the time, I don't know whether Facebook was talking about it or not, but that way of managing the fake information generated or caused damage, incredible damage. What do you think? I think that, unfortunately, that type of manipulation of information has always existed. What has changed now is that On the one hand, the elite complains because they've lost control. It's a more democratic, horizontal process. The hat maker in Florence can create Senator Cirenia and influences the public debate. But the use, manipulation, partial manipulation of information is one of the things that probably will die in the post-truth society, because at least the exclusiveness of this process is no longer to the elites and the governments. Unfortunately, the elite has a little big problem, a small big problem, because it exists. It has been put there to give answers. This elite is no longer able to give answers. People are sick of it. So the point that they say it's better to be honest, even though people are unable, that is to say they can't fulfill their tasks, rather than expert, because the expert has suggested lots of things, including weapons of mass destruction. So really, at that point, you want to have get your own back because you feel betrayed by the elite. And this is also true if you listen, for example, to the debate on the post-truth. You realize that there is an attempt to reinterpret the message in such a way that you can maintain the dominant position. Fact-checking is not true, because scientific evidence says that the fact-checking doesn't work. The user, if they like it, take it without the fact checked or not, and if not, they just leave it there. We already know the result, the end result. But Merkel, for example, says, let's put a fine. And I'm very sorry about for the Vatican.
Buonasera. Volevo chiederle invece un consiglio diretto.
I would like to ask you advice for new generations, for social networks, the use of social networks. There was a Stanford study which does not give a rosy outcome. They're so used to fake information is that they're not able to tell a fake news from true news, which brings us back to what we said earlier. We need new figures, new paradigms to interface with the complexity of the world. And I think it's primary schools that humanists or people in arts should not worry about it, because logic should be taught. It should not, Wittgenstein must not be niche. It must be mainstream. They gave an enormous contribution to our society. And the fact that Gödel and Wittgenstein are not even known by all academics is something very bad, I think. I'm thinking about what Wittgenstein said. We must be silent about what we don't know. He said, thank you very much. If there are no other questions, thank you very much. Thank you. See you next Thursday.